Hi, everyone. We are here today from the Center for Civic Design to talk to you all about how culturally relevant visual design can foster voter trust and engagement. My name is Emma Werowinski. My pronouns are she, her. And at CCD, I am our design practice lead, as well as an information designer and an AIGA member.
And my name is Andrea Miranda. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm the research practice lead here at Center for Civic Design.
At the Center for Civic Design, we have spent the past 10 plus years using research-based design as a tool to make elections more accessible for all voters. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we work with elections offices and advocates across the country using design best practices to remove barriers in the voter journey and invite participation in democracy. So we bring our expertise and a whole bunch of different skill sets, including user research and usability testing, plain language, accessibility, information design, as well as experience designing forms, web applications, and services, all to the challenges of making it easy for everyone to vote. We work on designs for every part of an election, from ballot designs and voter information, to mail ballot envelopes, to forms and notices. And everything that we make is based on what we've learned from our research, which we do with voters, election officials, and voter advocacy groups all over the country. We take what we learn from them to create tools and resources based on best practices to share with folks who are doing that work all over the United States. So our expertise is really in what we call civic design. Let me break that down for everyone. To put it simply, civic design is taking policy developed at the national, state, and local level, and turning those policies into real-life artifacts like voter registration forms and ballots, and processes like provisional voting and the experience of using a ballot marking device. We really believe that civic design is a lever for change. And when we see a problem or a gap in people reaching government services or acting on their civic rights, we use our design and research skills to close that gap. When we do civic design, we both make things beautiful and we make them work well so we can have a meaningful difference in people's access to their right to vote. What does all of that look like for us? We've been working on, for example, voter education research and design for the entirety of our existence as an organization. And I have a couple of examples here up on the screen. From left to right, a page from a voter guide for the state of Maryland, a postcard about ranked choice voting that was based on research we did in New York City, and some of our instructional illustrations that we use across election materials. In many ways, CCD's work is developing a visual language for elections. It's a minimal election design style that essentially focuses like scaffolding so that it's really giving structure to information. And we know that this works because we've been doing research on it for the entirety of our existence, and we've seen it put to the test in elections and jurisdictions all over the United States.
Now we're going to take you through our new research project, where we learn how to design culturally relevant voter education that can foster trust and engagement for diverse communities of voters. Through all our work supporting all the elections, we know that election officials, they struggle with creating effective, trustworthy, and engaging voter education. But with this research, we wanted to focus on supporting community-based organizations and their efforts for each election cycle. So we were particularly interested in hearing from communities who historically turn out in lower numbers. There could be information barriers or civic literacy gaps that keep them from voting. And we found that there was a lack of research on how visual design could inform and engage these diverse communities, which then led us to wonder, how might we make election design visually engaging, colorful even, attractive, culturally relevant? And what does it mean to be culturally responsive in communicating with voters? During the 2023 election cycle, we got the great opportunity to work with Ohio Voting Rights Coalition. They're a coalition of local and national community-based organizations working in Ohio. During this time, there were several voter law changes, such as like stricter ID laws. There was a shortening deadlines for mail-in ballot, among others. And advocacy organizations were super concerned that these changes would cause even more confusion for voters, especially for those folks, as I mentioned, that have been historically disenfranchised. So as we heard from this community member, and you can see the quote here, It's getting harder and harder to communicate to people that voting is easy. That's a hard one to take in. And this is really what precisely we hope that the visual design study that we've done could address. So we partnered with 5 wonderful organizations. They really, truly were wonderful. And that allowed us to reach a really wide range of voters. So we traveled to Ohio. We spoke with 62 participants across the 3 cities. More than half of the folks we spoke with were from the Black community in Ohio. In Akron, we were able to speak to young adults. There's a picture of them here. Some of whom were really excited because they were voting for their very first time during this election. In East Cleveland, we heard from older adults and seniors and low-income housing about the barriers that they face, some of which was like transportation, getting to the polls, and even their comfort level assessing online voter education. We also created and tested multilingual materials with 2 communities. So in Columbus, we spoke with new citizens from the Nepali and Bhutanese community. With the help of our partner, we were able to provide in-person interpretation services during all of our interviews, and we were able to hear directly with Nepali-speaking participants. Also in Cleveland, we engaged with the Puerto Rican community, so many of who are bilingual. Some had begun their voting journey in Puerto Rico and were now Ohio residents, which really provided an interesting and valuable perspective for us. And we were also spoke with students. Through our partnership in Cleveland, we were able to directly talk to students at Cleveland State University. So the new ID laws that I had mentioned earlier, they had a direct impact on them. Student IDs were no longer being accepted, so they were encouraged to vote by mail. Now, this multi-step process of mail-in voting can be challenging for new voters, of course, and even more so for first-time student voters. Before we dig in, I just want to give you a little bit of background on what we tested. So during these sessions, participants reviewed multiple information materials. So we tested variations on the design, the content. We really wanted to learn about people's perspectives, their preferences, and more importantly, the reasons why a certain piece of material resonated with them. So we tested visual design styles and color combinations. You'll see all the way on the left-hand side. On the top, you'll see a flyer that's black and white. Then you'll see in the middle traditional red, white, and blue voting colors. And then at the bottom, you'll see an explosion of color there and our more colorful flyer that we wanted to test to folks. We also explored imagery. So we included photographs and illustrations of people across diverse gender, racial, and ethnic representation. That was quite important for us. And we had some good learnings that we'll talk about within that. Equally important was to test different layouts, formats for bilingual materials. And then we also experimented with various layouts and depth of information. So you'll see on the right-hand side, range from postcards, social media posts, printed flyers, and also a multi-page civic guide. So this is probably my favorite research sessions. We conducted creative participatory activity where participants were asked to create their own designs. They were given pre-printed images and text, and they could cut and paste that they like. Also encouraged to draw their own visuals and also include their own headlines. Folks across all ages were really giddy. They loved the opportunity to be creative and, get hands-on creative with this research. So what we did notice that when they were creating these designs, we noticed that they were really taking in the content. They looked more closely, and we learned about their knowledge and the level of comfort with different voting methods. The stories that they were able to share during these creative sessions, they really ultimately gave us a much richer and more nuanced insight into their needs. So now we want to walk you through our research insights and recommendations. We're going to be tackling this together between Emma and I led the research portion of this work, and Emma led the recommendations and the design of our tool. Now, our research actually included 14 insights and recommendations, but because of time, we're only going to be guiding you through 4 of those. They will touch on trust, visual language, color use, and digital literacy. Let's get into it. Okay, insight 1. So we conducted some of our research in 2023 prior to Ohio's general election in November. And during that election, there was 2 controversial issues that were on the ballot. Issue 1 was about reproductive decisions, and issue 2 was about legalizing recreational marijuana. So when we tested these flyers with ballot 1 and 2, prominently placed on the top, as you see here, it evoked some really strong reactions from participants. We heard that the placement of the ballot issues on the flyers appeared to be biased, as if it was trying to sway them towards voting in favor of the issues on the ballot. So one participant here, after reviewing several of these flyers, just really expressed like a dislike for this particular flyer. And when I asked why, she said she did not support legalizing marijuana. So to her, the flyers seemed biased. She had an immediate perception that led her to believe that it was intended to influence her vote. And then within minutes, suspicions crept in, and then there was potential for distrust. Our learning here is that people are highly perceptive visually. So design elements have a big impact on the tone and the message of the content. Even a slight misalignment, as you saw in the previous slide, drew more attention to the ballot issues. And what we really learned is that the voters want basic voting information to be unbiased. That helps to ensure trustworthiness. So combining advocacy with basic voting information risks alienating undecided individuals and those that oppose the ballots based on their political views.
So what do we do with a learning like that when we try to turn it into a recommendation for people when they're making voter education? Based on this insight, we learned that the first thing that a voter should see on a piece of voter education material is a general invitation to vote. That specifically includes both the election day and the type of election. So starting with that general information right at the top of the material that you're creating gets readers the information that they need first without alienating them. An example of a top-line header message that worked well in our research was, "Are you ready to vote in Ohio's primary election on March 19th, 2023? And within that recommendation, our research added 2 nuanced considerations. The first is that there's a difference between making voter education materials and making advocacy materials. So voter materials should focus primarily on what voters really need to be able to vote. And they should avoid using ballot issues as a top line or a header message because those that have the potential to alienate voters and can be perceived as issue lobbying. And I thought this was such an interesting learning for me as a designer because I went in with the assumption that potentially starting with these issues are on the ballot would make people feel excited. It would make them more invested and interested in voting. But what we learned was that it actually had the opposite of that intended effect. And it made people feel like they were being influenced by the material, decrease their trust in it, which would then decrease the likelihood that they're going to read that information. So instead, we recommend if you are going to explain ballot issues on voter education materials, we tell people to cover that in a broad sense further down in the material and to link out to other sources for context and really to separate the 2 topics. The second consideration that we learned here was to avoid using really hyper-specific cultural language in top-line header messages. Same potential assumption here. We went in thinking, okay, maybe what if we put a greeting at the top of these handouts that really spoke to a specific cultural community? So for example, when Andrea was in Cleveland talking to the Puerto Rican voters that we were talking to, we tested a headline on one of these flyers that started with "Hello, Cleveland Boricuas," and that being maybe this will make people feel invited into the process. They'll pick up this flyer. But we learned that actually was not well received and perceived as quite divisive, and it led people to question and think about how they identify themselves. So instead of inviting people in, these 2 things that we tested had the opposite intent of the intended effect and made people feel left out from that process, which is why the recommendation here is to start with a general invitation specifically about the election that speaks to everyone.
All right, getting into our second insight. So red, black, and green color palette used on this flyer resonated really well with many voters who we spoke with, and they associated these colors with African liberation. Younger folks also associated with Black Lives Matter movement. However, some voters expressed suspicion about who was behind the information. So one participant that I spoke with mentioned that it seemed disingenuous and it felt like an appropriation and a co-opting of community colors. Now, we saw a similar response when we tested cultural imagery and color with Puerto Rican voters. So the image's Puerto Rican flag, it did resonate with them, but they were quick to ask who was behind the information presented to them. So we learned that culturally significant colors and imagery, they have an impact, but these design choices depends on who is sharing the information. Organizations need to consider their relationship to the community. So, for example, if the source is a familiar organization that primarily works with Black or Latinx, in this case, communities, using cultural imagery can foster a sense of community, sure. But if the source is a wider government office, voters told us that they were more skeptical and distrustful of this design choice. Why does this matter? So understanding this is actually really crucial because several of our partnering organizations are predominantly white-led volunteer groups. And they shared with us that they feel unequipped to engage BIPOC communities. So that was a lot. I'm gonna let Emma explain some of the concrete recommendations that came directly from this insight.
So what was interesting about this one is that I think the recommendation that came out of it that we're saying is quite simple to implement, which is great. A really interesting part about this research was digging into how to make or what culturally relevant should mean in a visual design sense, and really understanding how to turn that into concrete steps that people can take. So what we are saying here is that when you choose to use cultural imagery to engage with specific audiences, you need to start by assessing your relationship with that audience. And I turn that into 3 steps because when you're making a toolkit, it's nice to put things into short amounts of steps. So here we're saying you have to start with understanding who you are as an organization. So we're always talking, or in this case, we were creating a toolkit specifically for get out the vote groups, voter advocacy groups. So we're recommending those organizing groups understand who they are and who their identities, who the identity of the organization is, and who they are, their identities are individually. And then to understand who their audience is. Who are they trying to reach in the community? Are they trying to speak to a specific group of people, or are they trying to speak to everyone in a community with really diverse backgrounds? And there's a difference between if you represent and are part of your community versus if you don't represent the community that you're trying to reach. And here the takeaway is simply to avoid using imagery and colors that you don't have a cultural understanding of. Like Andrea was saying, when people thought that the Black liberation flag colors were coming from potentially a government office, that increased distrust, right? So to avoid making choices like that, they don't represent who you are as an organization if you aren't from that community group. And then third, to test things, to show your materials to people from your audience. Because while we've been talking about really big design choices, we really never know how a color palette or how an image might be taken by people in our audience. So it's really important to show things to people ahead of time before you launch them out into the world to make sure that you're avoiding causing someone to feel a certain way that will get in the way of them being able to engage with the call to action and the information that you're trying to share with them.
This one's a good one. This is a juicy one. Okay. Our participants overwhelmingly preferred colorful flyers over Black and white ones. That holds true across ages and across the community groups that we tested with. So what's interesting, though, is that we received feedback from 3 groups who found color particularly useful. So for college students, it was super useful. It helped catch their attention and break through all that noise, which is, could be overwhelming, some of the information that they're exposed to daily. Similarly, we heard from seniors with visual impairment that color helped improve reading legibility. So I heard from a senior with low vision, and he was able to read the majority of this flyer that you see here on the slide because he said that the color text boxes made the headlines easier for him to read, and it just really helped him actually focus on the letters. So the use of color also helped people who told us that they had difficulty concentrating. So white space, good color, it really helped ground them And it just made it easier for them to navigate the information without just feeling super overwhelmed with the process itself of voting, but also with new information coming in. The color really just helped to ground them. So we learned that color can help structure information to capture and direct voters' attention. So, like I said, intentional use of color and combined with good information design helped all three groups focus on the information they needed quickly. Our learnings really prove that color is less of a nice to have and more of an essential for some voters.
So I started out talking about examples of what our typical design style as an organization looked like at this. And it really was something that was majority black and white. Sometimes we added minimal color, but this research has really opened up what we now consider to be sort of like the workable middle of how design in this space could look. And that really is that we can be using color as a tool to direct people's attention as they're navigating complex information. And that when we say that, it's not just that it might be like a single color, but actually we can use like bright colors. We can use multiple colors, and that having something be visually engaging in that way is both visually engaging. It's getting people to pick something up, but it's actually serving a purpose as well. So color is helping people both skim and understand complex information. And we talk about color being useful for three reasons. First, that it can add importance. It's highlighting key information for people. Second, that it's adding hierarchy by grouping like information together. And third, that it's adding structure by separating out chunks of information that are on the same visual area that cover different topics.
All right, we're coming to our last insight here. This one was a good one and quite exciting to learn, actually. So, while we heard from younger voters that they welcomed online voter information, we also learned that new citizen voters and also seniors have barriers to online information. So, I'm going to share two extremes that we heard from our research. College students, they feel very comfortable and they're dependent on technology for their academic, even their social needs, right? So much so that young, new voters that we spoke to assumed that they could cast their ballot online or through email. Now, on the other hand, there are some seniors who were digitally savvy, but the majority of the seniors and new voters that we spoke to, they didn't have smartphones and were unfamiliar with QR codes and written website URL links. So let me just illustrate this for you. So during an interview with a new citizen voter from the Nepali-speaking community, we found that they didn't recognize the URL on the printed materials that we were showing. And when I asked further, she assumed that the URL must be related to the government, she said, but didn't quite make that connection that it was, in fact, an actual website address on the printed material. So even the seniors who did have the smartphones, they had limited knowledge to using the internet and were less likely to use it for voter education purposes, they told us. So these participants also found that written URLs on printed materials, it was really unhelpful. It's difficult to type them out. They're really quite long, right? So our takeaway here is that seniors and new citizen voters are not moving from print to digital. And because of that, they're not benefiting from the online voter information. That was a really big learning for us. One critical piece these voters did not know they had access to is being able to see their sample ballot online ahead of the election. I'm going to let Emma take it away again. Solve these problems through design.
Yeah, and I want to start by adding another reason why that's so important. So we know from our research as well that those types of information gaps very easily become lost votes, that when people are derailed by an attempt to get information that they need to be able to vote, they very quickly will run into a wall and will stop because it's a huge wall that they can't get over. And we live in a world in this country where we have both a distributed system of elections, so every jurisdiction is running their own elections, and also a distributed system of getting information to voters. Because voters are truly, everyone. We're speaking about people with all sorts of different propensities for information, abilities, access. The way that people get access to the information they need comes from a lot of different sources. It comes from printed materials, from hearing things on the radio, from the internet. from friends and family, but we can't really guarantee that anything that gets made by an election office or by a voter advocacy group is going to reach all of the people that it's intended to reach. Andrea was talking briefly about this, right? That digital literacy is people's ability to access, understand, and communicate with digital media. And I just said that people have, right, very different information access abilities, habits, and preferences. So it's very critical when creating voter education information to provide additional support to voters who need that digital literacy assistance. And that's because today a lot of voter education information can be accessed online. There's a huge push to do that for a lot of reasons. And to support voters to access that information across various touch points, it's important to include multiple methods to access it. So we have this new recommendation of how to put a website link on a piece of printed material that will support all of the different needs of people who are going to need to access that. So we have QR codes for people who are younger and who are fluent with using technology to access websites that way. We write out full website addresses. We include phone numbers for people who don't have internet access or for whatever reason or do not prefer to use the internet to get information. And we also include the word website before writing out website links for people who may be unfamiliar with how URLs are written. And last, also really recommend that both voter advocacy groups and election offices use short links for websites with meaningful words that are much easier for people to type out. Like in this case, Ohio has a short link of voteohio.gov that goes directly to their state Board of Elections website instead of needing to type out the full URL. And I'm going to repeat the story that Andrea said before. I just think it's like such an important anecdote that like with this push to have digital information for people, digital voter education information, it's really wonderful that people are able to access things like a sample ballot, right? That they are able to see what they're voting on ahead of time, specifically for them and their address, and that they can practice and be prepared to go out and vote. But we need to be able to support people to access that information. And that's why really like simple design choices like putting the word website down in front of the website link is so important. Because now the story Andrea was saying about the participant who didn't know that website address was a website address can now take that piece of paper or go to someone in her community and say, hey, like, I know this thing's at this website. Can you help me get access to it? So we're putting all that information in people's hands so they can get to the resource that they need to be able to vote confidently. And that was the end of our fourth insight to recommendation part of this presentation. You can read all of the insights and recommendations in our full research report on our website at civicdesign.org/research. And now I'm going to transition us into talking about how we turn all of those design research insights into toolkits for, in this case, for voter advocacy groups in Ohio to use to make materials for elections. So our goal with the toolkit that we built for them is to support community-based and voter advocacy groups to create engaging, accessible, and digestible voter education content. To use information design best practices for effective audience engagement, and to be able to easily create materials for multilingual audiences. So three really like big goals that we are always trying to do as an organization. And this toolkit that we built includes practical guidance, customizable templates, and resources. We've built all of our voter education toolkits around a theory that we call Bite Snack Meal, which is essentially a voter-centered content framework to think about creating, organizing, and presenting information to voters in a way that is digestible. The goal of the framework is to provide people with the right amount of information at the right time when they need it, while creating a pathway for them to dive deeper into the information if they choose to. And that's because we've noticed in our research, we talk about three types of voters. There are new voters who need to have critical information to be able to vote. There's I'm going to forget the name of it now, a middling voter who may want a little bit more. Maybe they vote frequently, but not in every election, and they want to have a bit more detail. And then there's a group we call avid voters who really want to know everything about the election. But those avid voters are a very small percentage of the population of people. So how do we, put voter education out in the world to support all of those needs, all of those types of people? We call it bite-sized meal. That's when we build information as bites, the smallest piece that tells voters, the critical step they need to take to be able to take action, to be able to vote. A snack that adds a little bit more context around that small piece of information, and the meal scale of information that really has everything. The toolkit supports these get out the vote groups through the process of planning, writing, and designing their voter education materials. To support planning, the first start of that process, it includes a bite snack meal communication strategy planning document that's designed to adapt to organizations' larger communication strategies. So it's helping people to clarify the goals of their messaging, to define their audience, and to identify specific needs of those audiences, and then to consider the appropriate channels to communicate those messages in a bite snack meal format. We imagine it being used either to create a new communication strategy. Some of the groups that we spoke to in Ohio truly were starting afresh every year and needed to build out that strategy, or to be able to audit existing communications to identify where there are gaps for more legacy organizations who've been working in the community for a long time. And we see the impact of planning processes like this being able to reach diverse and overlapping audiences with that right amount of information in the right moment. Just to dive deeper into how we imagine that happening for people, I'm going to walk through a bite example. So in this example, I focused on student voters, right? We had spoke to student voters, one group that Andrea spoke to in this research, and thinking about how to make explicit the needs of that specific population in Ohio. Student voters are often voting for the first time. They need really basic information about how to vote, right? They need to know, for example, that right now we vote by mail and we vote in person, that voting online is not currently an option, right? That was a gap that we heard. But they also need details about voting options based on where they live. Students are often, right, might be living on campus, maybe in their home community, but also might be living across the state or in a different state for college. So in that targeted outreach section, I began to write out, the specific subgroup I'm talking to, student voters, their need of basic voter information, education, and that the way that I would plan on communicating with them is through social media. And we imagine social media as being bites. So that tells me how I need to think about the scale of information that I'm communicating to be able to meet their needs. And the next step of this process is writing. To support writing, this toolkit includes a customizable messaging chart covering commonly asked questions in the bite meal format in the 3 languages that we tested in: English, Spanish, and Nepali. So we wrote out answers to these questions at bite snack meal level. Questions like, can I vote? What's on the ballot? How do I vote? Specifics about photo ID laws in Ohio, as well as information about what we are calling special circumstances, like folks who have accessibility needs or college students or justice-involved folks. The impact of documents like this is that instead of having to reinvent messaging every election cycle, people can return to one place that has answers that are true across time and update the information that they need to update. When we build out messaging documents, we always highlight things that might change across jurisdiction, between county to county in Ohio, or across election cycles, like when election day is and when deadlines are. And this example that I brought up is paired with that one I was just talking about, the bite-sized amount of information to answer the question, how do I vote? The third step of this process that the toolkit supports is the actual design of those materials. Once you have a plan, you know who you're talking to, you know the scale of information that you're communicating. And the toolkit we built includes starter templates and all of our design recommendations. I'm calling them starter templates because, going back to the beginning again, I talked about our design style as kind of like scaffolding. We think about it as the structure that we want people to apply visual design to add color to add images to. And the recommendations that came out of this research were considerations that people should think through when they're adding that visual design to the scaffolding of the information. So the recommendations are guiding organizations to think about their visual design and how to use it effectively to engage their audiences and give them the information they need. By the end of this using the toolkit, we hope that organizations might end up with something that looks like this. This is just one example, so don't judge me on it specifically. But you'll see that here we took that information, that bite-sized amount of content about how to vote, those 3 options, and we applied information design best practices about color, imagery, and layout, as well as the design recommendations to the toolkit. And when thinking about this toolkit, right, there's a whole myriad of things that people could pull out of what we put together for them. We've seen people simply use the messaging and use existing branding. We've seen people take actual templates that we've built out and use them as is, adding those colors on top. And we've seen people take the planning documents that we make and incorporate those planning documents into their existing processes. If you're interested in looking more at this toolkit and reading the rest of those design recommendations, it is at this link. And I really also recommend, if you are, talking to a group of designers, if you happen to be making voter education materials this fall for the election, I would really recommend going to read what we learned from this research. I couldn't have us end this presentation without talking about how it's going to be October 10th when you're listening to this. So we've got 25 days until Election Day. And every 4 years for a presidential election cycle, a lot of creative energy pours out into efforts to get out the vote. And it's really incredible to see. Like, we do this work every single day. And I love getting to see all of the creative, beautiful things that people make to encourage folks to show up and vote. And our hope is that by continuing to do research and create toolkits like this one, that we're really helping to improve the efficacy of that voter education across the country and starting to build a consistent language or consistent information, not just within jurisdictions, but really across the United States, that we're providing people with consistent, clear, usable information. And I really encourage everyone to engage with elections and with civic education more than just every 4 years. It's so exciting to see that in this moment, but I want to see that more. I want to see that every time you have an election in your community. There's a phrase in elections that, there's always an election somewhere. And it really is true. There is always an election somewhere. And voter education is a continual effort, not just once every 4 years. And that's because at CCD, we really truly believe that elections should work for everyone. And we use design research to make sure that they do. And you guys can as well. And I hope our resources are not just helpful to voter advocacy organizations and to election offices, but other designers as well. Thank you guys so much for listening to us talk about this project. We have our contact information in the upper right hand here if you have any questions, as well as our website. We do have a newsletter that we put out about every month, and links to the toolkit again if you hadn't gotten those earlier. One of our values is that we work in the open. So you truly can find all of our research and resources online. Please borrow from them and please use them in the work that you're doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.